You know, we live in an age of technology. You hear about technology a lot. And we live in an age of technology that is unlike anything the world has ever seen before. If you just consider the last 100 years, think about all the things that have been invented in the last 100 years. We've got television, personal computers, we've got cell phones, we've invented electric aircraft and jet-powered aircraft. We've sent people to the moon. We've built a big science laboratory up in the Earth's orbit that we call the International Space Station. We've done many amazing things with the technology that we've been able to develop over the last 100 years. And even more recently, we've seen things like the widespread use of the internet and social media. In our information age, we've seen that all over the place. And probably recently you've read about the use of artificial intelligence, or AI, and the widespread use of that in everybody's day-to-day lives, now and in the near future. And you know, you may be sitting there tonight wondering what in the world Christianity could have to offer you in an age like this. I mean, when we talk about the Bible is an old book, right? The Bible is an old book. So doesn't it belong in a museum? I mean, we might study it for historical reasons. We might find things in it that are interesting to learn about ancient civilizations. But what good could we possibly gain from something that is so old when we live in an age where everything that we think today is outdated by tomorrow? Well, tonight, I want to explain to you why I think Christianity can speak to us, even though it speaks to us from an ancient age, even though it speaks to us from 2,000 years ago. The truths that Jesus taught 2,000 years ago reach out to us as truths that can still give us insight today. Jesus can give us truth for our lives, even though the stories he told are 2,000 years old. Because when Jesus walked this earth, he proclaimed good news to all of humanity. And it wasn't just good news to ancient Palestinians and ancient Romans. It was good news to all of humanity. That means that the good news that Jesus preached 2,000 years ago is good news for 21st century Americans. It's good news for us. And if there is a tomorrow, it will be good news for those who live tomorrow. Forever, it will be good news. And we can see especially the relevance of the truth that Jesus brings to us in his stories. If you're familiar with the stories of Jesus, you'll know that he often spoke in parables. And if you don't know what the word parable means, basically it's a short story that uses some everyday truth to illustrate some bigger idea, some spiritual reality. And Jesus taught in many parables. These are spiritual realities that he's illustrating that reach into our souls. And despite all the advances in human technology, one thing that remains is the power that story has over us. For as long as there have been human civilizations, we have always been telling stories. From Homer's The Iliad and the Odyssey to Harry Potter and Twilight. Human beings have always been captivated by stories. And stories are really important. It's important for us to tell stories and to hear stories. It's important for us to understand our lives in the context of a story. If you want to have meaning in your life, you need to understand yourself as a character inside a greater narrative. You have to know that your life has a direction, that you're going somewhere, that there is a story behind your life. But marching alongside all of the technological innovations that we've been seeing in the recent years has been the evolution of our worldviews. From every corner, we hear different worldviews being taught and new narratives emerging, new stories within which we are supposed to fit our lives. And possibly the most difficult or worst of it all is that a prevailing worldview today is that there isn't any story for you to put your life into, that your life doesn't have meaning, that your life has no purpose, that it is going nowhere. And with all the competing worldviews and all the competing narratives or lack thereof, the age that we live in today, with all of the technology that we have, is a confusing time. Because we don't know how to understand ourselves. We don't know who we are. When everybody around you tells you that you're somebody else, that you're this person and no, you're this person, and that you don't matter or you do matter, it's a confusing time to live in. It is easy to find ourselves confused and unsure how to form a concept of the self. But you need a story to fit your life into. You need a story to understand yourself as part of. And that's what's so brilliant about the way that Jesus taught his disciples. Instead of just giving them some abstract truths that were just simple truths that they could write down in a bulleted list, he told them stories. He told them powerful stories that gave them the gift of imagination. He told stories that were true in the deepest sense of that word. He told stories that showed what life was truly like. He talked about farmers and families. He talked about kings. He talked about everyday people. He talked about life as we know it in ways that show us what we're here for. And these stories are stories that will never be outdated. They're stories that transcend the technology that are developed today and tomorrow. They're stories about humanity. As long as there are human beings on this planet, the stories of Jesus will be relevant. If you're here tonight, I'm going to assume that you care about your life. I'm going to assume you're here because you care about your life and you want to know how to live. And in the world we live in right now, there aren't too many good sources telling you how you should live your life. But you need a story. And not just any story. You need the story, the true story within which you can fit your life. And that's what Jesus can give you. So tonight, we're going to focus on just one of the parables that Jesus taught. The parable of the prodigal son. And it comes to us from the 15th chapter of the Gospel according to Luke. We're going to walk through it just a little bit at a time. We'll stop and we'll talk about it. And we'll try to understand how Jesus is not only telling the story of some character from a long time ago, but how he's telling us our story. Starting in verse 11, Luke writes, and he said, and that's Jesus. Jesus said, there was a man who had 2 sons. And the younger of them said to his father, Father, give me the share of the property that is coming to me. And he divided his property between them. Not many days later, the younger son gathered all he had and took a journey into a far country. And there he squandered his property in reckless living. In this story, Jesus tells of a man who had 2 sons. And evidently this man was pretty wealthy because we read later on that he had some hired servants. So he was an employer. And he was wealthy enough to be able to leave some inheritance to his sons. He had done well for himself. Well enough that when he died, his 2 sons were going to receive an inheritance that they could live on. And the Jewish custom of that day was that the oldest son in a family would get a double portion of the inheritance, and then the rest of it would be split among the remaining sons. So this father that Jesus is talking about had 2 sons, which means the first son would have received 2/3 of the inheritance, and the younger son would have received 1/3 of the inheritance whenever the father died. But the younger son has no intention of waiting until his father dies. He wants his inheritance now. So he goes to his father and tells him this. He says, I want the inheritance now. Give me the portion of the inheritance that's coming to me. He said, I'm going to get, whenever you die, a third of your property. I want it now. I don't want to wait until you're dead. You know, there are many ways that a child can grieve a parent. But this has got to be one of the worst. I mean, this son is basically saying, Father, I wish you were dead. I wish you would die today so that I could get the money that's coming to me. You know, it wouldn't have been easy for the father to give the son this money. It's not like the father had all this money in cash sitting in a bank somewhere. This money was tied up in property and in livestock and crops. The father would have had to sell all of these things and give it to his son. These are things that the father was still using. What an insult that the son would do this. But amazingly, the father agrees. He grants the request. So a third of his net worth is sold off and given to the son. And the son, this young man, leaves home and goes into another country to start a new life. Jesus says that the young man went to a far country and spent it all on reckless living. Other translations say that it was riotous or wild or prodigal living. That's where we get the name of this parable. He was a prodigal son. He's the reckless son. And we're not supplied with the details of how he spent his money exactly, but you know, it doesn't take a whole lot of imagination for us to try to think of ways that some young, irresponsible man goes with all this money and would spend his money. It's not hard to imagine the kinds of things that he would have spent it on. Whatever he spent it on, he wasn't making wise investments. He was spending his money on cheap thrills, something that would give him pleasure for just a little while. You know, when we hear the beginning of this story, up to this point, you're hearing this story that Jesus is telling us, and you're probably feeling angry at this son. You probably want to grab him by the collar and talk some sense into him and tell him what a little spoiled brat he is. But we have to be careful. I had an elementary school teacher that I remember telling us one time that when you point a finger at somebody, you've got 3 fingers pointing right back at yourself. And we've got to be careful. Because this story isn't just about some reckless, disrespectful kid who lived a long time ago. It's a story about us. It's a story about you and me and everybody sitting in these chairs tonight. This is your story. You see, we are the ones who have left home. We are the ones who were disrespectful. We've disrespected our Father. You see, God has made us for himself. God has made each one of you to be in relationship with him. He made you with the hope that he would be your father and you would be his child, that you would be joined together in love. But each one of us has walked away and said, no thanks. Each one of us has walked away like the prodigal son in the story that Jesus is telling. Just like him, we tend to choose our own way. We tend to see God or life with God as a restraint from which we would break free. We say we don't want to be under the command of God. We don't want to be under his authority. We don't want him to tell us what to do. We want to do our own thing. We want to go our own way. And so we do. And we spit in the face of our Creator and we leave home. We spend our lives recklessly on things that will only give us pleasure in the moment. Pretty soon it's all gone. We waste the precious life that God has given us trying to break free from him. Jesus continues his story in verse 14. Jesus says, "And when he had spent everything, a severe famine arose in that country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to one of the citizens of that country, who sent him into his fields to feed pigs. And he was longing to be fed with the pods that the pigs ate, and no one gave him anything. So this man runs out of money. His entire inheritance, a third of his father's net worth, just like that, it's gone. You know, it was bound to happen with the way that he was spending his money, but I'm sure it still came as a shock whenever he reached down into his purse and found that there was nothing left. He had been spending money on just about anything he wanted to, and now he couldn't buy anything. He probably had gained a bunch of friends while he had all this money, and now I'm sure they've all left him. And unfortunately for this man, when it rains, it pours. Because as soon as he has spent all of this money, suddenly a famine strikes the land. There isn't food anywhere. And so he tries to find a job. But you know, in times of struggle, in times of famine, there aren't too many jobs to go around. There aren't too many things that you can do. But he finds some work. He finds work feeding pigs. Now, to a Jew, pigs were unclean. They were disgusting. So for this man to take a job feeding the pigs would have been humiliating. It would have made him feel so low. But he had to. He was desperate. There was nothing else he could do. So he took a job feeding pigs. But even that job didn't give him enough money to be able to feed himself. And as he fed the pigs with whatever he had, he looked at that food and wished that he could just eat a little bit of that. This man was truly desperate. It doesn't get any lower than this. At this point in the story, he has hit rock bottom with nowhere to go and with no one to turn to. And while earlier in the story we might have been angry with this young man, by the time we get to this point, we pity him. We feel sorry for him. And in some ways, I think we can relate to him. Because, like we've already discussed, this is our story too. He is us, and we are him. We are the ones who are starving, who are desperate, who are lonely, who are trying to find something to fill us up and can't, who are reaching for anything around us in this world, in our lives, to sustain us, but nothing will do it. And the more and more we reach out for the things around us, the lower it takes us. The lower we go as we desperately reach for things to fill us up. You see, this is where pride takes us. This is where envy takes us. This is where lust takes us. Every sin which we struggle with, whatever sin it may be for you, that you struggle with, lands us in a place of misery. That's the end of sin. Take pride, for example. You know, you've probably heard the expression that pride comes before the fall. That expression is derived from a proverb. It's a little bit different in the Bible, but the expression that we hear commonly is pride comes before a fall. And that's a concept that we can really understand. It's a concept that we see played out in our lives all around us and in us ourselves. Those who become proud are doomed to fail. Proud, or pride, describes a person who thinks too much of themselves and thinks of themselves too much. They are concerned with their own possessions, their own achievements, their own success. They are thinking of themselves and of themselves only. And this is not an attractive trait to have, but not only that, but it is destructive to your soul. A proud person never sees their own weakness. They go through life thinking that they're the best, they're strongest, they're the smartest. And they never see what their weaknesses are until one day they're laying flat on their face and they wonder, how could this have happened to me? But pride goes before a fall. But most importantly, pride prevents you from loving other people. Because if you're only ever concerned with yourself, how could you be concerned for the things of others? How can you look out for someone else when you're only looking after number one? You can't do it. You'll constantly be wondering why everybody around you is always getting in your way, and it will ruin your relationships. And so it goes with all other sins, whether it's envy or lust or greed, whatever sin you can think of. Every person has their particular sins. You know, maybe you're obsessed with comparing yourself to other people. Maybe you follow people on social media and you see their accounts and you see all the things that they have and all the things that they do, and you're envious of them. Oh, how you wish you could be them. And maybe your friend has more success in life than you do. Maybe you wish you looked like them. And this envy controls you to the point where you hate yourself and you hate these other people. Or maybe you're an angry person. And if things aren't exactly as you like them, you get livid. And you find that your anger blinds you and it binds you, and you are unable to treat others with kindness and with patience. You can't do it. Or maybe you're constantly giving in to lust. You want what you can't have. You know, in your mind, you live out this fantasy that maybe it could be yours. But what has that done for your actual relationships? If your mind is always occupied with fantasy relationships, how can you love those with whom you are in actual relationships? And worst of all of these sins distance you from God, the one who made you and loved you even before you were born. Each one of these sins will do this to you. Whatever your particular sin or sins, you can see this pattern in your own life, can't you? You can see the destruction that your own sin causes in your life. All of us who give in to sin follow the pattern of the prodigal son, which is to say that all sin lands us in the pigsty. Filthy, desperate, lonely. We are crushed by our sin. And like the prodigal son, we find ourselves far from home. Verse 17, Jesus says, "But when he came to himself, he said, 'How many of my father's hired servants have more than enough bread? But I perish here with hunger. I will arise and go to my father, and I will say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Treat me as one of your hired servants.'" As this man grew more and more desperate, Jesus says that he came to himself. I love that expression. I love that phrase that Jesus uses there. He came to himself. It's like he awoke. He had been living his life one way, and he'd been going this way continuously, day after day. He'd been living this way, and it wasn't working out for him, but he was stubborn. Like a mule, he would just not wake up to the reality. He would not change his direction. And then one day he came to himself. He realized his situation. He looked around himself, saw all the filth, the mud, the pigs, and he thought to himself that it was time to make a change. He remembers what home was like. He remembers, ironically, how his father's hired servants were fed better than he is now. So he resolves to return home. And he knows that he was in the wrong. He knows that he should not have done what he did. He should not have disrespected his father like he did. He should not have taken the inheritance. He should not have behaved that way. He realizes what he's done. But he hopes that maybe his father will take him back, just as a hired servant. He knows that his father is under no obligation to take him back as a son. He's lost that right. But maybe his father will have enough mercy to just let him be a servant in his house. So he gets up and he turns home. A few years ago, when we were expecting our first daughter, Nora, I decided to apply for some life insurance. And as part of doing that, I had to go get a physical. They had to make sure that I was physically healthy to grant me this life insurance. And so I went to this appointment. It was early in the morning, so I could leave from there and go to work. And I was in a hurry that morning like I usually am. And so I decided to skip breakfast, which is not really an unusual thing for me to do. That's kind of typical. But I arrived with an empty stomach, which usually isn't a problem. But as you may know, if you haven't eaten in 12 hours or so, and you have a large amount of blood drawn from your body, you may pass out. And so I went from sitting in a chair, having my blood drawn, and the next thing I knew, I was laying on the floor looking up, and there were nurses gathered around me explaining to me what had happened. And I was laying there thinking, how did I get here? What happened that resulted in me laying on the floor? The last thing I remember was sitting in this chair. How did I get here? There are days in our lives when we wake up and wonder, how did I get here? This year I'm going to turn 30 years old, and it's kind of a milestone. I've been looking back on my life and the trajectory of my life, and I think about the things that I've done and I haven't done, and there are some things that I think about, and I think, by the time I was 30, I thought I was going to be more successful than this. Or by the time I was 30, I thought I was going to be in better shape than this. Maybe you can relate to some of these things as well. You wake up one day and you say, how did I get here? You look in the mirror and decide, I don't really like what I see. And it's not always just a few extra pounds or a receding hairline. Sometimes we wake up one morning and we look in the mirror and say, I don't like who I am as a person. I don't like how I've been treating my family. I didn't used to be like this. How did I get here? I smell terrible, like the man in the pigsty. He wakes up one day and says, how did I get here? It's often only once we've hit rock bottom that we realize what our problem is. It's often only once we've gotten to the lowest of lows that we wake up, that we come to ourselves, and we see the problem. We see the sin that's been weighing us down all this time. You see, sin is like a weight on your ankle that you might have if you go swimming. You could swim for a while with a weight on your ankle, but after some time, it's going to drag you to the bottom of the pool. It's going to weigh you down. But it's at that point that we realize what our problem is. We finally realize it's our sin that's weighing us down. It's our sin that has us starving among the pigs. But Jesus repeatedly tells us that once we've hit rock bottom, we're finally at a place where we can start to experience change. The most famous sermon that Jesus ever preached, called the Sermon on the Mount, opens up with this line. He says, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." What he's saying is the poor in spirit, these are people who have woken up to the reality of the sin in their lives. These are people who have said, I have a problem. They are poor in spirit. These are those who have finally come to themselves and said, I don't want to do this anymore. Is that you tonight? You may have been living one way in your life for some time. Maybe it's just a few months, or maybe it's been a few decades. But at some point, it will drag you down, and you'll hit the bottom, and you'll say, how did I get here? And you'll know that you need to change. Is that where you are tonight? If that's you, it's time to turn around and go back home. And you may be sitting there tonight thinking, yeah, I probably should make a change. But you don't understand the things that I've done. You don't know the terrible ways that I've treated other people. You don't know the pain that I've caused others. There's no way that God would accept me. If I turn around and I try to go back to God, He's going to laugh in my face. If that's the way you're feeling tonight, you need to listen to how the story ends. Jesus continues in verse 20, and he arose and came to his father. But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and felt compassion and ran and embraced him and kissed him. And the son said to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. But the father said to his servants, Bring quickly the best robe and put it on him. And put a ring on his hand and shoes on his feet. And bring the fattened calf and kill it. And let us eat and celebrate. For this my son was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found. And they began to celebrate. So the prodigal son, with his dignity lost, his reputation shot, he goes back home. He's walking down the familiar roads that lead back to the place where he grew up. And on that way, he's practicing his speech that he's worked out, that he's going to say to his father about how he's sinned against heaven and before you. He's no longer worthy to be called his son. Just accept me as a hired servant. And as he's walking back home, his father sees him from a long way off. And his father gets up and runs to his son. Now you have to understand that in this time, Jewish men did not run ever. It was not dignified for them to do that. It was disgraceful for them to run. But the father did not care because his son was coming back home. And when they meet, the father embraces him and hugs him and kisses him. And the younger son tries to get out his speech. He gets out part of it, but the father cuts him off before he can even finish it. And he tells the servants, go get the fattened calf and the robe and the ring and the sandals. He said, tonight we're going to celebrate. Because my son was dead, but he's alive again. He was lost, and he's found. The prodigal son, who expected to face judgment when returning to his father, instead found a warm welcome. The young man expected his father to be angry, but Jesus says that when his father saw him at a distance, his father felt compassion. His father felt compassion for this son who had disrespected him. Whatever offense his son had done was in the past. And what mattered was that he had returned. What mattered is that his son came home. What mattered was that he had his son back. This is your story. You know, we talked about technology and all the wonderful things that we see developing in our society, and we can get a lot of use out of all the technology that's being developed every day. But one of the things that the technology will not be able to give you is meaning and purpose in your life. It will not be able to tell you who you are and where your life is going. But Jesus gives you that. Because the story of the prodigal son is your story. You want to know what your life is about? You want to know what your life story is? Your life story is a homecoming. Your life story is the story of some child who was lost and is coming back to their father. Do you feel that? Do you feel the homesickness? Do you feel how living a life, doing whatever you want to do, pursuing pleasure above all else, leaves you empty? You feel how something's just not right? Come back to the Father. And maybe you are thinking to yourself that your sin is great and that you can't return, that you've gone too far, that you're ashamed of what you've done. But I've got to tell you that everybody in this room would say the same thing. Everybody in this room could tell you things that make them feel ashamed. And the Father wants you back. Our church has a food pantry. We have this food pantry once a month. And we have people come in who need help. And we hear all kinds of stories and sad stories about their lives, about things that have gone terribly wrong. We hear all kinds of stories, and we hear about these people, and they want us to pray with them. And they tell me about their children, their adult children, who are in very difficult circumstances. They tell about children who are in prison, children who are in deep drug addiction, children who are involved with all kinds of things, and their relationships are not good. And with tears, they say how much they wish that they would turn around. They want them to come home. It doesn't matter what they've been doing. They just want them to come home again. And I want you to know that that's God's heart for you. That it doesn't matter what you've been doing. God wants you to come home. So why don't you do that? Come forward while we stand and sing.